Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Okay, so we talk inshallah today about Surah 19, the Al-Balad, the town or the city. Okay, here's the English first, and then we'll go through the. I swear by the city in which you dwell, by parents and offspring. Indeed, we have created man in affliction. Does man think that no one has power over him? He says, I have spent abundant wealth. Does he think that none observes him? Have we not given him 2 eyes, a tongue, and 2 lips, and shown him the 2 paths? Yet we would not scale the ascent. Yet man would not scale the ascent. Would that you knew that what the ascent is, or do you know what the ascent is? It is the freeing of a slave, or the feeding on a day of, or the feeding of a poor man or a poor person on a day of famine, of an orphan near of kin or a needy man in distress, and to be of those who believe and enjoin one another to patience in adversity, and enjoin one another and enjoin mercy upon one another. Those who do this shall be on the right hand, and those who deny our revelation shall be on the left hand, with fire clothing upon them. This is Adil Salahi. It's a new translation. I don't know if we need new translations of the Quran, but anyway, Muslims will continue producing new translations. It's fairly straightforward, and like so many other translations, that it just generates the most basic structural meaning. It's important before we delve in that just keep in mind again that we're taking we started now for a long time ago with the shortest surah, and which are reported to have been also the first surah of the Quran, the first chapters of the Quran, and the ones that shaped the Muslim ethical structure, because these are the chapters of the Quran that laid down the foundations upon which everything else will be built. So it is important that if you haven't listened to the tafsirs of the previous surah, that you do so, because they're all cumulative and they all build upon one another. They're not necessarily, they all convey a cumulative message that forms Muslim morality and Muslim ethical identity. Okay, so لا أقسم بهذا البلد وأنت حل بهذا البلد. Oh man, okay. So first, most sources say that this surah was revealed in Mecca, pre-migration, pre-Hijrah period. However, Ibn Atiyah and a few other authorities say that no, this was actually revealed in Medina, which is typical for many chapters of the Quran, that we don't always know with certainty whether a chapter was revealed in Mecca or Medina, and Al-Balad is not an exception in that regard. Okay, second point. As you will see, because of a discussion about what the first verses of this chapter refer to, there is a significant debate as to whether it was revealed before Hijrah, before migration, or whether it was revealed very late as late as when Mecca is defeated. So upon Fatih Mecca, or was known as the liberation of Mecca or the defeat of Mecca. And you'll understand in a second why this debate is important. Um, okay, so La uqsimu, typically when the Quran has that lam, that's lam al-ta'keed, or the form of oath taking by Allah in the Quran, where you say la uqsimu, then it in fact affirms an oath by signifying the importance of something. But with this chapter, there is an interesting debate. Does it actually say la uqsimu, meaning I swear by this town, which refers to Mecca, or is it saying la al-nafiya, meaning I do not swear by Mecca? Why did this debate arise? Why do we even have a debate as to whether here the Quran intends to swear by Mecca or not swear by Mecca? And we always talk about layers and levels of meaning. So there was one point raised, and that is Mecca at the time that this chapter is reportedly revealed has a significant amount of idols. And this is, if it was revealed in fact before the Mecca is defeated, so it is full of idols. And some theologians, Quranic commentators said, well, how could God could swear by a town or by a city that in fact is full of idols? But that was not the most significant objection, because the response to that, the idols are transitory, but the status of a space in Allah's creation is not transitory. So you can in fact swear by something that's sacred, knowing that this is the town which was established by the Prophet Ibrahim and his son Ismail and his wife Hagar, and that the idols come and go throughout human history, but that's not. So that objection is not that significant. The second thing, the second point, which is more significant, is about the sacredness of Mecca. There is a debate whether Allah is saying that this town, this city, Mecca, is now sacred territory and sacred from the moment of that revelation in perpetuity, and what that sacred means. Here, the second verse and the debate about the second verse is very interesting. Why does it say وَأَنْتَ حِلٌّ فِي هَذَا الْبَلَدِ, and you reside in this town? Two schools of thought. One is that God is telling us, when God swears by something, then we know that it is of great significance and of great import. And in fact, God is honoring the Prophet والسلام, by saying that you are sacred that this Mecca is sacred, and in fact your residence in Mecca is an imminent source of blessing, an imminent source of barakah, emphasizing or underscoring the importance of the historical moment and the importance of the role of the Prophet ﷺ. So that's one school of thought, which is actually the majority school of thought. The second one said, well, these particular verses were referring to a historical set of events. What are these historical set of events? when the Prophet conquers Mecca, we know that the Prophet gives a safe guarantee or a safe conduct to all the residents of Mecca, with the exception of 3 people who were not given safe conduct. In other words, as to these 3 people, they continued to be in enemy combatant status. And for this group of commentators, they said what these verses were referring to is to say that from now on, Mecca is sacred, and I'll explain sacred in what sense in a second. Mecca is sacred except for the fact that the blood of the 3 people might still be spilled. So in other words, creating an exception to the rule of sacredness, an exception granted only to the Prophet in his refusal to give or not extending the safe conduct to these 3 individuals. I'm not going to get into why these 3 individuals, but one of them, who's probably the most interesting, pretended to convert to Islam, endeared himself enough to Muslims and volunteered to be one of the writers of Quranic revelation, but when he would write the Quranic revelation, he would alter it. So he would write the Prophet was, and the Prophet was illiterate, so the Prophet would say the revelation and he would write it erroneously, and then eventually, after having infiltrated Muslim lines, he converts out of Islam and joins the armies of the Meccans again, and brags about having distorted and corrupted the Quranic revelation. Now, of course, that didn't go anywhere because we know exactly what he wrote, and we know exactly, enough people had memorized the Quran, and there were several writers of the Quranic revelation, so we can simply compare and contrast what he wrote as opposed to what everyone else wrote. Anyway, he's an interesting fellow, and Islamophobes love to invent all types of stories about this guy and come to the average Muslims who probably never heard of him and probably never heard of the story. And I can't tell you how many kids have come to me, but how about, how can we make sure that the Quranic revelation is accurate? Isn't it true that someone infiltrated and was writing the older? And of course, when you read it in Islamophobic literature or in Islamophobic lectures or evangelical sites, that's the level of things that it impacts you very differently if you have no background. Anyway, okay. There is a third perspective before I circle back to even just this opening salvo of verses. That the Quran, when it says, and you reside in this city, many scholars said, no, it's actually not talking about either the grant of safe conduct or the conquering of Mecca or the not granting of safe conduct to these 3 individuals. What it's talking about is the fact that this city is supposed to be sacred, but the Meccans do not recognize the sacredness of the blood of the Prophet ﷺ and Muslims in that city, so that they would easily spill the blood, and in fact try to spill the blood of the Prophet. So in fact, when it says وَأَنْتَ حِلٌّ فِي هَذَا الْبَلَدِ, and you reside there, it is referring to the fact that, if you want, the paradox between the status of Mecca as a sacred city and the fact that the Meccans do not recognize the sacredness of the blood of Muslims and especially the Prophet in that city. Okay, so these are now. Is there any further material that can help us understand the debate between these three positions? Perhaps the most important report in this context hold on. Where did it go? Yeah, okay. So the report, I'm just going to read it first in Arabic quickly and then إن الله حرم مكة يوم خلق السماوات والأرض فهي حرام إلى أن تقوم الساعة لم تحل أحد قبلي ولن تحل أحد بعدي ولم تحل لي إلا ساعة من نهار فلا يعضد شجرها ولا يختلى خلاها ولا ينفر صيدها ولا تحل لقطتها إلا لمنشد فقال العباس إلا الأذخر يا رسول الله فإنها لبيوتنا وقبورنا فقال إلا الأذخر. Okay, so what this hadith is referring to is that Mecca is sacred space. Bloodshed is not allowed, was not supposed to be allowed before the Prophet or after the Prophet. According to this tradition, and there are variant reports about this, is that the spilling of blood in Mecca was allowed only for an hour after the conquering of Mecca. But again, as I say, there are a lot of versions of the report don't have that caveat of illa sa'a min nahar. It is so sacred that you're not supposed to tear down its trees, build upon its land, hunt in its space, and in fact, no level of destruction or alteration is allowed in Mecca. And then one of the companions, Al Abbas, tells the Prophet, "Well, how about the Zukhr is tree barks that you build, that you sort of connect to create ceilings in homes." So he tells the Prophet, how about that? Because we use that to construct our homes. And the Prophet says, no, that's not covered by the prohibition. So not to confuse you. So we have layers of meaning. What everyone agrees on is that Mecca is, the reason Allah swears by Mecca is that it is sacred territory. And that before the Prophet Muhammad and after the Prophet Muhammad, the spilling of blood is not allowed in Mecca. The killing of prey or hunting is not allowed in Mecca. And in fact, building or destruction is not allowed in Mecca. So in other words, the altering of the topography itself is not allowed in Mecca. That's what everyone agrees on. Now, is it referring to the Prophet ﷺ residing in Mecca in order to emphasize the role of the Prophet as a pivotal point in Meccan history? Or is it referring to the fact that after Mecca is conquered, there are still 3 people who might be killed in the territory of Mecca, but that exception was created only for the Prophet and to no one other than the Prophet. Frankly, it's a debate that doesn't matter that much to us because the net result is the same, is that it has become sacred, whether you create an exception for these 3 people or you don't create an exception for these 3 people. Furthermore, to be quite honest, the evidence that this surah had anything to do with the conquer of Mecca is very weak. And the whole narrative about it's referring to the 3 men who were not given safe conduct is not very strong. Okay. Now, this of course raises a very interesting question. If that and Muslim jurists had very extensive debates about, well, can you develop Mecca? Can you build new buildings in Mecca? Can you tear down old buildings in Mecca? And the clear consensus before the modern age was that yes, but not around the area of the Haram. There was a debate, especially in the Abbasid period and again in the Ottoman period, as to whether you can expand the area of the Haram to accommodate the larger number of Muslims. But I mean, we don't have time to go into all of that. But Muslim jurists argued for delving into the tradition, argued for numerous constraints and rules and conditions as to how you can do that without violating the sanctity of Mecca. So, for instance, one of the most interesting debates during the Ottoman expansion are debates about how you can, or rather than debates, I should say discourses. One of the most interesting discourses is that how you can ensure the safety of the laborers working in Mecca so that no one would get hurt and you have accidental spilling of blood. So the irony is some of the most advanced labor laws that were ever developed were during the Ottoman expansion of Mecca. Now, of course, that raises a very interesting question. How do we explain what has happened with Mecca since the Saudis took over? Because none of these, neither Abbasid rules were respected, nor the Ottoman rules were respected. And the Ahl al-Hadith, who are supposed to be the Wahhabis and supposed to be the Saudis, completely trashed that. I mean, not even trashed, but didn't even deal with this Hadith or this group of Hadith that emphasize that Mecca must remain sacred space as it is. Of course, in Saudi history, there have been numerous people who were, during the Wahhabi overtake of Mecca, there were massacres, there were a lot of people killed. A lot of Sufis, a lot of different groups, Hanafis, Malikis. But even beyond that, the tearing down of numerous historical sites in Mecca and the building of high-rise buildings, I don't have an answer for you. I mean, I'm very aware of the jurisprudence produced by Saudi muftis, and none of it deals with any of that. I mean, they just give it, they don't even mention it. As if it's non-existent. Of course, with the turnaround that we saw with issues like music and Christmas and parties and so on overnight, now we have even a much better understanding of how the fatwa institution works in Saudi Arabia. It's basically whatever the government wants, and they rubber stamp it. But from an Islamic point of view, the erosion of the sacredness of sacred space is and this connects to that issue I was talking about earlier, the colonizing of the Muslim mind, is very critical, because we human beings, all human beings, have areas of sanctity, of sacredness, all of us. When a woman 1,000 years ago would relate to her body very differently than a woman relates to her body today. It's because of her sensitivities that has been produced as to the sacredness of this body. Even the way human beings, whether man or woman, in fact, related to something like sexual assault or rape 1,000 years ago is very different than it does today. I mean, I grew up in a context in Egypt where if a woman was raped, she could commit suicide or starve herself to death, which by our standards here would seem to be an irrational response. We see it as an intense trauma, but it's not something that should be equal to death. We relate to issues of sacredness and sanctity in our construction of meaning all the time. We are a product of, so if I told you, for instance, sex was a child, your reaction to that is because of your inherited notions of what ought to be sacred and untouchable and what is not. So one of the most effective ways to colonize is to chip away at the sanctities of a people. So when the Spanish first colonized the natives of South America, the various cultures of the first thing they targeted was their temples. And the first thing that was targeted in Spanish colonialism in Andalusia was to turn the sacred space of mosques into churches. Because when people have their sacred spaces defeated, they in turn become defeated. This explains to you our lack of reaction to the consistent violations against the Aqsa Mosque in 50 years ago. Our reaction to what happened to Aqsa Mosque is very different than our reaction today. The reason is the way we connect to sacred space. But if your relationship to sacred space at the heart of Islam, Mecca, is chipped away in this fashion, you in turn, the way you will feel it, although you cannot intellectualize it or you cannot necessarily identify it, is to have a sense of loss, a consistent sense of loss when you think about who you are. Or you think of the image of the Kaaba and you feel a bit of a gulp in your throat. That's the erosion of sanctity. Although it is embedded deeply into the culture that has constructed you. So it's a very serious problem. Interestingly for me is that Muslim theologians in this context talk about whether God is promising us that Mecca will remain sacred or God is urging us to keep Mecca sacred. And the overwhelming majority say, and I think that's sort of, although I don't believe in historical determinism, but I thought that was interesting in that they say that, in fact, God is saying that you Muslims will remain healthy as long as Mecca is healthy, as long as Mecca is sacred. Sacred not meaning that you just can go do Hajj, as I said, but you don't spill blood, no one suffers, no one hurt, no animal, no bird, no tree is injured or hurt or killed. Again, it begs. I know that there are political prisons in Mecca, and there are people who are tortured in Mecca. It's eerie. For someone who doesn't believe in historical determinism, it's sort of eerie. Okay. Yeah, the final point I'll make, you see, the Quran is a book that needs several lifetimes. Several lifetimes. The other, because I just remembered another point that when when the Quran says وَأَنْتَ حِلٌّ بِهَذَا الْبَلْدِ and you reside there, it is also referring to another historical fact. It's telling the Meccan people, long before the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, knew that Mecca had a special status. And they had a mythology about the Prophet Ibrahim and the Prophet Ismail and his wife Hagar, although that mythology had become mixed up with various pagan beliefs, a sort of a hodgepodge of paganism, some Christian ideas, some Zoroastrian ideas, and so on and so forth. But they knew that this was, and the Kaaba in particular, was of a sacred status, and we know that because we know that there were several efforts. The Byzantine Empire was spreading, it was powerful and present in Syria and in Egypt, and the Byzantine Empire had thought of expanding its influence into Arabia. The Byzantine Empire had even at one point controlled Yemen and attempted to convert Yemen to Christianity. And there was an effort at one point, an idea by the Byzantine Empire, that we should tear down the Kaaba and instead of the Kaaba build a massive Christian cathedral and force these Arabs to do pilgrimage to the Christian cathedral. That historical effort failed. There was the famous story of the invasion of the elephants by Abraha, who was reportedly Christian, although that's not a historical fact, but reportedly Christian. Anyway, so we know that although the Meccan Arabs knew that this is sacred space and knew that it is, they did not welcome Byzantine domination and did not welcome Persian domination or Sassanid domination, as opposed to the Arab tribes closer to Persia and closer to Syria, who in fact had accepted Persian domination, Byzantine domination for a long time and regularly paid a poll tax to these empires. And you reside in Mecca is a reference to the fact that the Prophet Muhammad did not start advocating or calling for his prophecy as a non-entity or an unknown person to the Meccans. They had lived with this man, knew his character, knew his personality, knew his ethics, knew his morality. As the commentators say, that they know your asl and your nasab and bara'atak tulul umr, and his purity and his purity is the best word. His purity, that the fact that this is a man that they in fact knew was of impeccable moral character, and that in fact among them, if anyone would be of such a moral character as to live up to the special status of Mecca, it's as if telling them, you know that it would be this man. Now, this is important because, again, one of the clear strategies of Islamophobes that unfortunately has penetrated to Muslim psyches everywhere, all over the Muslim world, is to cast doubt as to the moral example of the Prophet Muhammad. And again, go back, listen to Hershey Ali's infamous lecture in the National Press Conference, which she gave in 2006, where she said the West should lead the quote unquote reform movement among Muslims, and there's no hope for reform unless first you sever the ties between Muslims and them thinking of the Prophet Muhammad as their moral example. And at the time that I heard that lecture in 2006, I thought it was idiotic. I thought it's ridiculous. It's never going to happen. Today, 2019 or 2028 now, among our children and among our siblings and among all the new generation, whether in Egypt or even back home or here or in the West, everywhere, they all have questions suddenly about the moral character of the Prophet Muhammad. And I had never thought that وأنت حل في هذا البلد is that important until I think of my experience as a Muslim in the West and all the impact. To make you have questions as to the moral leadership of the Prophet ﷺ is to undermine your very relationship to all notions of sacredness in your life. Because if you have questions about his moral character, everything else collapses. Regardless of how much you pretend it doesn't, everything else collapses. Before you know it, you're going to be asking questions about what's the point of prayer, what's the point of fasting, what's the point of anything. And that's why it's to be quite honest, a brilliant strategy. And if I mean, not telling you to do that, but if you actually spend as much time reading Islamophobic literature as I have, you'd find that they're constantly comparing between Jesus and Muhammad. Look, Jesus lived 34 years and never committed a sin. And Muhammad, look, all the questions. And he lusted after this woman, and he did this, and he killed this person. And I mean, we're not going to respond to these things now. But the fact that I even feel like I need to respond to them over and over and over again, I can't tell you how many Muslims write me. But how about, oh, I have a crisis of faith. And when I told them, أنت حل في هذا البلد, doesn't mean anything to them. They say, well, Allah reminds you of the moral character and the moral leadership of it doesn't mean anything to them. Okay. What time is it?
7 o'clock.
Okay. Okay. ووالد وما ولد. Of course, the translation is rendered in this Adil Salahi by parent and offspring. I wish life was so simple. Anyone else has any other translation? I'm just curious.
I have one open on my phone. And the begetter and that which he begat.
Okay, that's actually better than parent and offspring. I mean, both of them actually capture a nuance of the meaning. But begetter and okay, so we get ووالد ولد ووالد وما ولد or والد وما ولد. Walid is the begetter, the parent of something, and walad is an offspring of something or the begotten. Now, why does it deserve a pause? Well, what is Allah is swearing by this. So what is it about this that deserves, and that's a question, by the way, that the commentators would always ask. Why is Allah swearing by this? Why? What is the significance of them? We know that they're a parent and child. So what? Whenever the Quran swears by something, it's as if the Quran is setting off an alarm bell. Pay attention, this is important. This deserves reflection. And you can't just, as the so-called tanwiriyun or the enlightenment people, simply read a text and pontificate out of your excuse me, any part of your body that you wish. But you have to consult any incremental evidence as to what that could indicate to you. You have to investigate all circumstantial evidence as to what could underlie that form of oath taking. And again, to abridge a lot of poetry and a lot of pieces of evidence, circumstantial evidence that we pick up from different places and so on. But here's the gist of it. So the form here, as it say, it takes the form of hal and mustaqbal, that it refers to this process of birth and rebirth, present and future. So at the first level, it's referring to a generational process. And any time, and here again, unless you want me to spend 20 minutes on the pieces of evidence, but whenever the Quran refers to a generational process, like when it refers, as to the previous surah, to the process of movement and change in creation, it is immediately also alerting you to the challenges that come from that process of birth and rebirth. So immediately it's as if the Quran saying, okay, sacred territory is sacred man, or a man of great importance, and constant generational change. So what is the challenge here? To maintain the sacredness. Know that in this constant generational change means a challenge immediately. Parent and child will be constantly challenged to maintain that legacy, that trust that God has given you. So that's at one level. There's the debate, for those of you who know Arabic, there's a debate about al-atf wal-ma'tuf here, walid wa walad atfun ala madha, but for all purposes I'm going to have to skip it. But it's, I mean, for someone like me, it's really fascinating. But anyway, but then there's another reference in that notion of generational process and generational continuation and generational challenge. The story of Mecca started generations ago by what would have seemed to history like something completely innocuous. The Prophet Ibrahim taking his wife Hajar, going to this desert and leaving Hajar and his son Ismail there, and as you know, the story, the narrative goes that Hajar then runs out of supplies, and there's the miracle of the well of Zamzam, which still continues till today, unfortunately not preserved in its original state at all. Nothing like the original Zamzam, unfortunately. But it's still the same water, which was the miracle of Mecca, and that building and it took generations. Now, generations in which the Kaaba was even buried under dust, under sand, completely, and had to be redug at different points. In other words, the very foundations refound. And then various tribes and various people and pagans came and pagans went until the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And because our ancestors took the Quran very seriously and thought about the Quran very seriously, they said, well, there is also a reference to the challenge posed to understanding, and as we'll see when the Quran, when the surah later on tells us, alerts us to the role of patience and the perseverance and the role of at-tarahum, or conducting our affairs through compassion and mercy, it will come back full circle. But that generations build upon generations, and to understand the trajectory of Allah's message, you can't take a snapshot in the moment in which you exist. So for a lot of the people that I studied with, they would always tell me, you cannot understand the message of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ unless you go back and study the message of the Prophet Ibrahim onwards till the Prophet Muhammad. And of course, even before Ibrahim, like Idris and Salih and Nuh and Adam and so on. But at a core, Ibrahim, because that's where the narrative of the sacred space starts. Among modern Muslims, and I've lived long enough in the West to and visited enough. I mean, we've lost that. Again, I underscore, to understand why Muhammad ﷺ was the last prophet, you cannot possibly make sense of it unless you understand what the prophecy of Ibrahim was about. If you do, then it makes sense. Then you understand why the successions of generations of prophets. And walid wa ma walad alerts you to these layers of meaning in, as typical of the Quran, in a brilliant, succinct, truly miraculous linguistic form. Like literally like pressing on a button. And you can be a literalist who gets absolutely very little from it and say, you know, offspring and begetter and begotten and that's it, and move on. Or you can do exactly what our ancestors, and that's what made Islam flourish the way it is, take the Quran seriously and say the why. When you ask why, you're not committing a sin. You are walking the path of knowledge. So why does Allah swear by that? Okay, yeah. I forgot one thing. Now, but our ancestors didn't stop there. They saw in wa walid wa ma walad, again, oath by the sacred space of Mecca, oath by the moral character of the Prophet, and the generational process, is that Allah is swearing, they didn't fail to notice, is Allah swearing by generations of believers, or is Allah swearing by generations of human beings? Just from the language. وَوَالِدٍ وَمَا وَلَدٍ. Human beings. Now that is, if you're thinking deeply about the Quran, that must give you pause. As they say, فَقَدْ أَقْسَمَ بِالْآدَمِيِّينَ صَالِحُهُمْ وَطَالِحُهُمْ. God is swearing by human beings, whether good or corrupt. So I understand you swearing by the sacredness of Mecca, you're swearing by the moral place of the Prophet in relation to the sacredness of Mecca, but then why do you swear by generational process of human beings, whether they are believers or non-believers, whether they are good or bad? Now, you can be a serious, an intense philosopher and spend hundreds of pages talking about that, or you can take the most obvious meaning of it. Why would God swear by that? All human beings, good or bad. As-salih wa-talih, as they say. Let me put it this way, differently. When you study history, do you just study the history of good, or do you study the history of bad? Right? Good and bad. And when you learn from history, is the lesson taught to you valuable just because it's learned by the good? Or do you learn as much from studying the bad? Both. So it would, in fact, have been a completely different dynamic if Allah just swore by generations of believers. It's as if Allah saying, study the believers and don't study anyone else. But that's not the Quran. The Quran is extremely profound, with layers of meaning. If you want to maintain the sacredness of Mecca, and you want to understand the moral role of the Prophet, pay attention to the generational process, good or bad, absorb it and study it in equal measure, because all of it has tons to teach you. And that's the secret in as-salih wa-talih. Some even go and say وظهور العجائب في البنية والبهائم, that they say actually when it says ووالد وما ولد, and this I mean it is actually quite brilliant, and several of commentators notice that it doesn't necessarily just refer to human beings, right? It's even telling you anything that is begotten from anything. And they said, well, generations is not just the story of human beings, but it's also the story of animals, and the story of architecture, and the story of art. الخط الإسلامي, or الخطوط generally. So some of the most fascinating parts is that you find in various Quranic commentaries that tell you, and from وَوَالِدٌ وَمَا وَلَدْ is a reference that you cannot even understand Quranic Arabic unless you study Syriac and Aramaic and Hebrew. And I mean, it starts then blowing your mind that you must reflect on all living things and the entire dynamic of life, which, by the way, again, connects to all the surah that we talked about. The God is constantly saying, you want to understand the way your maker, the way the divine unfolds in your life. Study the handwork of the divine. And part of that handwork is وَوَالِدٍ وَمَا وَلَدٍ, the dynamic of development and change and progress, and the challenge of keeping the sacred at the same time that you confront the challenge of the constantly changing and the constantly evolving. Everyone with me? What time is it? 15? Okay. I thought like, oh, I'm going to get through Surah Al-Balad tonight, no problem. Yeah. Two final notes about Walid and Walad, and then I'll have to move on. I checked a tafsir that was published recently in Saudi Arabia, written by a group of contemporary scholars. It was written before MBS, so it still reflected the Islam pre-MBS Islam. Now, pre-MBS Islam is dead, and now we're living in MBS Islam, which is basically who knows what type of Islam that is. But it's said that when it says walid wa ma walad, it only refers to the generations of believers. I wasn't surprised, but again, if a modern Muslim is studying this and doesn't know anything about the tradition, I should tell you that grammatically, and this would be interest only for the people who study Arabic, that grammatically, for عند البصريين, I'd say, used to say, for the walidin wa ma walad to refer only to believers would be grammatically impossible. So it's just linguistically wrong. So it just doesn't work. Anyway, I wonder now in MBS days what they would write. Anyway, in numerous commentators have the following language, and I'll just say it quickly in Arabic. ووالد وما ولد تكريم لخلق الله لما فيهم من بيان ونطق وتدبير واستخراج العلوم. أي أنه لم يخلق الإنسان عبثا ولا باطلا. That when Allah swears by ووالد وما ولد, and I just use Arabic because you know what I'm referring to, that in that, parallel to or right after Allah swore by Mecca and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, or at least his role and his moral leadership, that in this is honoring and glorifying human beings, or we can even say entire creation, in my opinion, although that's not what the text, they said human beings, but I say entire creation. But what captured my attention in is how they derived civilized meaning from this revelation. So they said that why would God, what is the operative cause in honoring a human being? And they say it is the things that makes human beings a truly miraculous creation. نطق وتدبير وبيان, the ability to reason, واستخراج العلوم, and the ability to learn. Now this is consistent with so much other, there's so much in the Quran that emphasizes this same, but this is how, and when people tell you the Quran built a civilization, go to the micro level, and this you start understanding why the Quran built a civilization. Because if the readers of the Quran read وَوَالِدٍ وَمَا وَلَدٍ and understood from it just the begotten and begetter and begotten and moved on, nothing, there's no energy that is generated, there's no movement, there's no inspiration, you're not going to have any type of momentum being built. But if you look at وَوَالِدٍ وَمَا وَلَدٍ and you tell yourself, oh my God, God is honoring creation and honoring human beings, and honoring human beings specifically because of their ability to reason and to learn, استخراج العلوم والتدبير والبيان, then begins the process which we saw unfold in the Islamic civilization of becoming interested in libraries and manuscripts and philosophy and sciences and the Abbasid, the library in Baghdad, and the entire thing that unfolded that produced the Islamic civilization. In my opinion, the relationship, and I've said this many times before, the relationship of Muslims to the Quran will define the health of the Ummah at any time in history. If the Ummah reads the Quran and interacts with it the way we interact with it mostly today, because often, I mean, and again, we not me, but we, most of us, I mean, because I was privileged in that Allah tested me by giving me many opportunities, and that's, a test, and a burden. But when I think of a lot of people that grow up and listening to Quranic commentators in Islamic centers, and I've attended in the Islamic Center of Southern California, someone commenting on Surah Al Balad many years ago, 10 years ago, and you get nothing. It inspires you with nothing. It just a bunch of words, and in fact, you don't understand what's so special about the Quran. I mean, you can't even answer really why did the Quran inspire an entire civilization, and what makes it a unique text in you can't even answer about a unique text in Arab history, leave alone in Islam, in human history. And when you can't, when your teachers are so inept, then the product makes sense. Okay, enough about Walid and Walad. Otherwise, we will. Okay, I'll skip the Asma Gins, دخول الحيوان, skip all that. Okay, okay. At this point, I can't skip, and I'm really sorry. Forgive me, but I will have. I do have a cutoff point, so I'm not gonna keep you. Okay. I should have. Many of the commentators and many of the scholars, and you find this even in writings on theology, not just writings on Quranic tafsir, is from walidin wa ma walad, is that they say حرمة الخلق كلهم, that when Allah takes that oath in relation to the previous oath that we, ayah 1, ayah 2, first verse, second verse, third verse, that Allah is alerting you to the sanctity of human beings, all human beings. Now, for that time, these are people writing. Keep in mind that they're writing in, many of these commentators start in the 9th, and the ones that I'm referring to specifically, in the 9th AD up to 14th AD. For people in that time to write about sanctity of human beings is mind-blowing, is extremely advanced, because we don't even start giving any sanctity to the common human being until basically the entire Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution and the invention of human rights. And I mean, the idea that sure, aristocracy was always sanctified, and rulers were even divine, not just sanctified, but the common lay human being was always seen as expendable, of no worth. They come and go. How do you fill your armies? How do you get noblemen to tell people to go fight wars? By telling human peasants and agriculture that they matter? No, by telling them you don't matter. You only matter through us as nobility and as rulers. And that was very old and very ingrained in Roman law onwards. I mean, in old common law, and the common lay human being had no worth. So at that time, for these Quranic scholars to say the value of, or the sanctity of human beings, period, all human beings, was a revolutionary concept. The sad thing is that for Muslims it remained revolutionary in our age, because most Muslims think that the Quran doesn't sanctify all human life, believer or non-believer. They actually bought into the garbage about, in Islam, apostasy, this and infidels and jihad, and they don't even know how to start even responding to that if someone really puts the question to them. Okay, what time is it? Where's Grace?
She's upstairs.
Where did she go? What happened to her?
Not feeling well.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
She gave you, you guys exhausted her so badly when she gave the talk. Why? She was fine yesterday. Well, she didn't sleep. Okay. As much as it hurts, okay, I'm gonna stop here so we can have some Q&A if you guys want. Um, you know, I mean, it's because people always are interested in Q&A, and of course, I thought I'm gonna actually cover the entire surah, and we only got to 3 verses. Oh, okay, okay, okay. So we can have some time for Q&A. Otherwise, then we won't even do. Okay, to be continued, inshallah. So, Grace is not here. You have to be the boss.
Yeah. So, you want to do one?
So Q&A for 25 minutes.
Yeah. And then why don't we just open it up to any questions since there's only 25 minutes?
I suppose feel free to skip over this question because I'm just really. I mean, you're going to be discussing it when you get there, but I was just really interested in the وما أدراك ما العقبة فك رقبة. What is the significance of that? I mean, obviously, I'm cheating by asking for more tafsir instead of Q&A.
You're jumping ahead.
I'm jumping ahead, but
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, maybe we should just skip it.
yeah, I mean, because we'll.
Sir, do you want to ask your question too?
Okay.
Let's just get all the questions out and then you can go.
Me or okay, yeah. So I have a question about sanctity of Mecca, looking at it historically. So when we talk about the violating of the space, whether it's through construction, whether it's through bloodshed, the various things that were mentioned, and then we look at how in the past, let's say during the Umayyad period, the Kaaba was destroyed. And so when it comes to sanctity, I mean, from my understanding is that as the Kaaba, it's like the center of it all. Right? So if the Kaaba was destroyed in our past, how does that help us understand sanctity in our present time? And does it give us any hope? Okay, the Kaaba is it's still there. So we haven't gotten to a point where anyone has, like, in the present time, has destroyed it. But yeah, I don't know. That just came up while we were talking about sanctity.
So my question was that what do you mean that the message, you can see how the message started with Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam and ended with Prophet Muhammad? You could understand why. I was just curious. What did you?
Okay, so the Aqaba thing is, inshallah, we'll get there. Are you still going to be here? I guess these things are taped, huh?
No.
Oh.
But yeah, I can.
Yeah.
I mean, I do have another question that I could substitute.
Well, go ahead. But
Yeah, so maybe because this is going to be covered later, I'll
Okay.
withdraw that one. But this just sort of popped into my mind when we were talking about. I can't remember exactly the point that you mentioned, but I was thinking about the notion of progress and just like in order to understand the sort of message of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, understanding previous revelations and how the idea of revelation being delivered as discovers more and develops and grows, etc. And the whole philosophical notion of progress is one that's kind of debated today. You have people who say it's a Eurocentric, Christian-centric concept that's just used to dominate and exploit, whereas other people are talking about, oh, there is such a thing as progress and humanity is becoming better and achieving things. And I mean, this is a really vague and broad question, but just what does how does like a sense of progress sort of fit into like an Islamic theology?
Yeah. Okay. So, um, okay. So the prophecy of Ibrahim alayhi salam and the continuation thing, and then the idea of progress and what was it?
Sanctity.
Sanctity. Oh, the idea of sanctity. Okay. Yeah, I mean, they're actually there's connection between all of them, and also a connection between the whole idea of Aqaba. But Surah Al-Balad is is a is among the surah in the Quran that pose a continuing challenge to Muslims specifically and to human beings broadly. And there are various revelations of the Quran which were understood, and they are clearly to be understood as setting a moral trajectory for human beings, and that's the challenge. So when it talks about we'll talk inshallah, we'll get there. We'll start whenever the Quran talks about an obstacle, aqaba, and an aqaba is a serious obstacle, uh, and then tells human beings of something that's truly aspirational, like that there would be no poor person who experiences starvation, or that there would be no yatim, no orphan in a state of need. Well, obviously, this is stating something that was not achieved either before the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, or at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, or even after the Prophet Muhammad. So it can or freeing of slaves, which when we inshallah get there, there's a lot of important talk about it. And quite often the Quran speaks in terms of a moral challenge that sets a moral trajectory for Muslims. And when you think of, for instance, how Muslims in a time in which it was truly odd for human beings to think in terms of the sanctity of human life, in just general terms like that, because not even Greek philosophers spoke in terms of sanctity of human life. Not even the most enlightened Zoroastrian thinkers, or Hinduism before Islam and after Islam, because Hinduism was heavily influenced by Islam. But even I mean, which were had anchored in the caste system that was very old in Hindu thinking. Buddhism is a whole different thing, but even in so the idea was, and it was, how did that idea come to be in the Muslim psyche? And it came to be through this understanding of a moral trajectory and a moral challenge. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. Now, this goes back to this notion of the idea of the sacred space, and how Muslims related to the idea of sacred space, because it connects to the notion of the sacred generally. Quranic commentators who were writing in the 3rd century Hijrah or 4th or 5th were writing after the Qaramita had invaded Mecca and after Yazid had bombarded the Kaaba with mangonels, rock throwers. And so they were aware of these historical precedents. They were very fully conscious of these historical precedents. And they often do talk about that and saying, well, it's clear that what Allah did was the invasion of Al-Fiyala, the invasion of the elephants, was there's a Abraha prepares an invasion of Mecca and plans to tear Kaaba down, and the year of the birth of the Prophet ﷺ, and the army of Abraha is defeated by divine intervention. But what's very interesting is that none of them understood that precedent as a promise from God that the Kaaba will always be protected. But they understood it as a divine intervention because God wanted history to unfold in a certain way. But beyond that, it is a moral challenge. That, okay, I intervened in the case of Abraha invading the Kaaba now, and I've maintained the sacred space in order for the Prophet Muhammad to come and convey the message and for things to unfold in a certain way. But beyond that, now I expect you to uphold the challenge. So they were not troubled by they were not troubled in the sense that they didn't consider it a challenge to the revelation that Yazid bombarded the Kaaba or that the Qaramita invaded Mecca, but they saw it as a clear violation and a major failure. And in fact, what's interesting is that the number of people who comment that the reason Allah allowed the Umayyads to be overthrown and to be slaughtered was because the way they failed the Kaaba, which, I mean, of course, they're talking about generations later, but still. And that if Muslims fail their duties towards the sacred space of not just the Kaaba, because they talk about Mecca, at least the Haram, which is a area much larger, then that's sort of like a barometer as to where Muslims are and Muslims and to what extent they can expect Allah to uphold the divine end of the bargain. It's like, Allah made promises, but promises contingent on our actions. And if we fail, then we complain that God is not delivering. Well, but the entire contract has been broken. So, and I think it's I mean, some of them, especially the Sufis, go even further and they say that if the Kaaba is violated, then the heavens are closed, the doors of the heavens are closed, and Allah basically turns away from Muslims and say, I'm not going to answer any of your prayers until you start with, at a minimum, restoring the sacredness of the Kaaba, which, I mean, their imagery and their poetry get very, and I hope that they're not right, because if they're right, then we're in serious trouble. So I really pray that all of that is allegorical about the heavens closing its doors and the angels not visiting Muslim homes anymore, and all of that interesting material. But interestingly, the idea of so that's an important component, because a lot of Muslims are raised by their families with sort of like this very colonized mentality and very dependent mentality of, oh, Allah will take care of it, Allah will protect it, and that's nonsense. If you don't protect the Kaaba, Allah's not going to protect it. It's your responsibility now, and to sort of count on divine intervention. Definitely, when I was in school, I remember my school teachers saying things like, "Oh, if anyone ever comes close to the Kaaba, Allah would send birds that would carrying stones, and the whole thing what happened was Abraha would happen again." And that's just years of learning later, you realize that that's a complete invention. Okay, so now this connects actually to the question you raise, because the reality of the matter is that whether we call it progress or not progress, meaning is never static. I mean, think even as something as simple as what is the relationship of the divine to sacred space. When that teacher was teaching me that Allah is going to send birds with stones that will destroy any army that comes close to the Kaaba, she was as much of it an invention as anything else. So we are constantly inventing and reinventing meaning. We often just don't recognize that we do. We are constantly. And that's why if you actually have honest people, if they read hadith, for instance, often they find it very difficult to even understand what the words are saying. Because language, Arabic language, has changed, has evolved. And language changes, space changes, psychology's consciousness, is constantly shifting and constantly constructing and reconstructing itself. And that is why the relationship of the sacred as an anchoring point, too many anchors and you're shackled. Then you can't evolve, you can't adapt. Too few anchors and you're disconnected from all meaning, and you go in cyberspace, you float. So the real challenge that the Quran itself poses to us is to find that mizan between anchoring ourselves in the sacred, but the recognizing the inevitability, and yes, at times the moral worth of change and growth. Now, the important point here, though, in order to understand the way that morality marches, whether we want to call it progress or not progress, but the way that morality works, the way that ethics evolve. You want to call it progress or not progress, it doesn't matter. That's not the issue for me. But definitely when you look at the ethics of the Prophet Ibrahim, who we know was prepared to sacrifice his son. Anyone that is prepared to sacrifice his son today will have child welfare take their kids away. That's a change in ethics. But it made perfect sense when Ibrahim at the time was surrounded by people who sacrificed their children all the time. And the practice of human sacrifice to appease gods was a historically common practice even in the prophetic periods. According to the Bible, even according to the Bible, prophets of the Bible not only sacrifice their children, but they also sell their children to slavery. According to the Quran, they don't. What is interesting about the Quran is that it maintains the prophetic example as a constant anchoring moral example. So the Quran, not talking about outside the Quran, but the Quran itself doesn't affirm as an anchoring ethic any ethic that should, or we should say, should not be a constant and immutable ethic. In other words, all the ethics that the Quran affirms are ethics that in fact could be absolute moral principles. Now, beyond that, we negotiate meanings of ethics, and that's the inherent in the idea of ma'ruf itself. What's good and what's bad is that it's socially constructed all the time. Now, the problem, though, when it comes to the issue of progress, is that we are plagued by a couple of things. We are plagued by the fact that whatever is claimed as human moral progress, especially when it comes to the value of human beings, we did not produce, we did not really participate in as Muslims. And it's also plagued by a severe legacy of hypocrisy, because we know that natural rights played a critical role in colonialism and in the destruction of native cultures, and that even till today, human rights are, no one, France doesn't care about human rights when it comes to the slaughter of certain Libyans, and cares about human rights when it comes to something else, and so on and so forth. And to extract our philosophical thinking from the tribal factor of who participated in what, the ethno-nationalistic factor of, well, we didn't contribute to it, so I'm going to reject it offhand. It's like the early debates about the Aristotelian philosophy. Some Muslims took the position Persian and Arabs didn't contribute to Aristotelian philosophy. So how could you call him the great teacher, Al-Muallim al-Akbar? How could you possibly do that? While other philosophers said it didn't matter. It doesn't matter. We should take the ideas as ideas. The second challenge is that legacy of political hypocrisy, which is very difficult because it really challenges our emotional core. To look at what is consistent with the morally anchor point of human value, and to try to purify it from its nationalistic appendages and its power dynamics, and to look at it as sort of a philosophical idea in light of the anchoring moral points of the Quran, is a real challenge. And it's a real challenge to do it meaningfully, in other words, to assert it in a brave fashion. In other words, to do it without playing politics. So to do it while not simply confirming moral points because they're socially popular, or challenging moral points because there is a political reason for it. So one of the easiest things, like today, all over the Muslim world, you find the pro-Assad people, the pro-Sisi people, the pro-Haftar people, the pro-MBS people, MBZ people, the pro-Southern Yemen faction, mocking the idea of the prohibitions against torture as, the human rights folks. And, then you start, it's an imperialist conspiracy. While the prohibition against torture is as Islamic as you get. So it drives me absolutely nuts when someone comes and talks to me about the prohibition against torture as somehow not moral progress, and even worse, those who try to go back and pluck the worst in our tradition to justify torture in order to legitimate a supposed Islamic authenticity. To find out, let's use the term, what are Islamic moral absolutes, and this relates to Shireen's question. We cannot do so without going back to the core of the monotheistic message from the time of the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. So we study, in fact, what is consistently for God an uncompromising, constant, stable, consistent point of affirmation. And when we do that, I will actually find, in my view, that they're not as numerous as we think, but they're extremely critical. And then we have points of guidance as to how we negotiate meaning of morality from variety of sources with a considerable space for debate and disagreement and pluralism. So I don't think the prohibition against torture, for instance, is one of those things in which we can disagree. I think that's God reserving to God's self the right to torture and not that being extended to anyone but the divine is absolute and unwavering. My position about slavery is quite similar. Now, of course, you come to this issue, well, for something to be morally absolute, is it necessary that the Prophet ﷺ would have, or the prophets would have, in fact, achieved it in their lifetime? And my answer is no. It is enough that they had aspired for it in their lifetime. If I have indications that I know that the Prophet Ibrahim ﷺ had slaves. We know that for all the sources, biblical or any of at least the sources that he had slaves. But we also know a great deal about the way he treated the slaves. The way he treated his slaves, and correlates with when the Prophet ﷺ tells us, Prophet Muhammad, and I'm surprised that a lot of Muslims don't know this, that tells you don't call your slave, don't call abd, or لا تقول أمتي وعبدي. Don't say my slave or my she slave. But قل غلامي وفتاتي, what would translate literally as my boy or my girl. In other words, don't refer to them as slaves. But that to me is very significant, because it's consistent with what the Prophet Ibrahim did. It's consistent with what Moses did. It's consistent with what Isa did. It's consistent that they were constantly aspiring to undermine the institution of slavery in a variety of ways. And so as a Muslim, if I can do away with the institution of slavery, I don't see a moral inconsistency. Now, there are things that are very clear, and there are things that in which there can be considerable debate. But that sort of absolutist way of thinking of it's either the West or the literalist model of tradition, qua tradition, and nothing but tradition. It just cheapens our tradition enormously. In a lot of the khutbahs, if you go back to my older khutbahs, you'll find that I talk a lot about the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, and I talk a great deal about that because I know that a lot of Muslims are that's not part of their modern psyche, and I think you'll find a lot of that material and that's why, by the way, I started getting into the Bible. I started quoting the Old and New Testament quite a bit, because many of our scholars, in order to be scholars, read the Torah and read the New Testament and leave alone the traditions of the Persians. And I mean, there's the writings on Persian Zoroastrian theology and Islamic tradition as mind-boggling. And I find it deeply troubling that my scholarly ancestors, didn't consider one to be a scholar unless you knew languages. You knew Arabic, Aramaic, Hebrew, Syriac, and you read text in these. And when you were expected to be fully a citizen of the world that you lived in. While today, we have these boutique little institutes, the Sunnah Institute of this or that, the Hadith Institute of this or that, as if we live in, I don't know, what do you call it, ghetto? I mean, the worst ghetto of any type of ghetto where the world doesn't exist, where a lot of people think that you could actually, even in the United States, they don't even bother perfecting their English, leave alone Aramaic or Hebrew or Syriac or, just even English. And that is why Muslims, although 1.6 billion in the world, and they own and they control more than half of the world's energy resources, produce less than 2% of the world's literary production. That immediately tells me everything. If you don't have intellectual curiosity, you failed that religion. Without a question, because what I understand from the legacy of the Abrahamic prophets is that they would come and consistently challenge the narrow tribalism and blind myopia of paganism, and the insistence on methodological and fantastical thinking of pagans. And they would say, no, there are laws to creation, there are laws to causation. And it's no coincidence that among the things that Muslims wrote the most about are exactly that, causation, as-sababiyya, which, by the way, was the genesis for all modern sciences, because without causation, there's no science. Paganism didn't believe in the laws of causation. That's why alchemists believe that you can turn nickel into gold. Miraculous thinking. Why did the Quran and the Prophet Ibrahim ﷺ and Moses and even Moses, who used, but even in the Old Testament and the New Testament, why did they condemn magicians and magic? What by that they mean sorcery. Why did they so consistently that we can say to the point that sorcery is the anti-sorcery position is one of these anchoring absolute points of monotheism? Because it is non-causistical thinking. It's either there's a suspension of causation, and that has to be divine miracle, and we confess and we admit and we believe in it, but it is the rare exception. It is not the common occurrence. One final point, Muslims wrote a great deal. The only Christians for a long time among Muslims, the only Christians that existed were Catholic Christians. And Catholic Christians have always believed in relics and miracles. And some of the most remarkable writing that the Muslim civilization produced is in the refutation of miracle thinking, what they often called Christian miracle thinking, but of course by what they meant by their age was Catholic, and relic thinking, because they thought that this notion of relics as intervening in the laws of creation was paganism. I mean, it's all it's transformative and it's revolutionary, but it is also rediscovering who we are as a people. Okay, how are we doing on time?
It's time to stop.
Okay.